The colossal glass-walled conference hall at the International Forum glowed with an ethereal light, reflecting the intensity of the moment. Cameras and lights were positioned meticulously to capture every slight movement, every word, every breath. The world was watching. Behind the lights, behind the camera lenses, the tension in the room was palpable, thick with anticipation. The air hummed with the quiet buzz of whispers as people exchanged glances, wondering what the night would hold. It was a rare event, an event that transcended the usual debates or press conferences. This was something more, something monumental. At the center of the stage, seated with poised authority, was Eleanor Chase, the renowned moderator and head of the forum. A fierce intellect known for her unyielding approach to political interviews, she had the uncanny ability to dismantle even the most hardened politicians. For years, she had conducted some of the most difficult interviews, extracting the truths behind polished facades. Yet tonight, she faced an entirely different kind of guest. One who, despite being a product of the same world, had managed to avoid the traditional path. Seated across from her was Barron Trump. Though his name had been known worldwide, his presence in the political world had been a matter of whispers rather than declarations. Until tonight. Barron had remained largely silent, preferring to stay out of the media's gaze. But this evening marked a shift. Dressed in a sharp navy suit, with the weight of his name hanging heavily in the air, Barron exuded an unshakable calm. His posture was relaxed, composed, his gaze unwavering, a stark contrast to the high-stakes nature of the event. There was no flash of nervousness in his eyes, no twitch of unease in his body language. He was ready to confront the questions that would define not just this interview, but perhaps his future as well. The atmosphere was thick with tension as Eleanor adjusted her microphone, her face wearing a slight smile of curiosity. She had studied Barron for years, watched him grow up in the shadow of his powerful family, but tonight would be different. Tonight she would push, prod, and seek answers. And Barron, the young man who had been carefully sheltered, would have nowhere to hide. Eleanor's voice broke the silence, sharp and controlled. "Mr. Trump," she began, addressing him directly, "this is a rare moment for you. You've kept a distance from the spotlight for years. Why step into it now?" Barron met her gaze evenly, unwavering. His response was measured and deliberate, each word calculated. "Everything has its time, Eleanor," he replied smoothly. "And this is the time." The room shifted. Eleanor, seasoned and sharp, wasn't easily rattled. But this was different. This was a moment that would be watched by millions. She let the silence stretch, observing him carefully. His voice wasn't aggressive or defensive, but rather calm, deliberate, as though he had been waiting for this exact moment. The audience, hanging on every word, could feel the tension. It wasn't the typical back and forth of an interview. It was a subtle exchange of power. And Barron Trump, despite his young age, was already holding his ground. "People know your name. They recognize the power it carries," Eleanor continued, leaning forward. "But beyond the name, who are you?" Her words were sharp, calculated. She was digging deeper now, searching for the man behind the name. Barron's expression remained unreadable. The silence that followed her question seemed to intensify the weight of her words. It was as if every person in the room was waiting for Barron to crack, to reveal a glimpse of the man beneath the public image. Barron paused for a beat. He wasn't a man of many words, but when he did speak, each word carried weight. Then in his calm, unshaken voice, he answered, "I'm someone who chooses his path, not because of my name, but because of the steps I take." A murmur ran through the crowd. It was a response not driven by defensiveness, but by a subtle power. Barron wasn't trying to protect a legacy. He was asserting control. Eleanor could feel it. She wasn't just conducting an interview. She was stepping into a game Barron had already mastered. Eleanor's next question came quickly, as if she had expected this answer. "Many would argue, though, that your legacy has shaped your every step. After all, you didn't start from scratch. You inherited power, influence, and wealth. How do you reconcile that with the idea of truly defining yourself?" She threw the question out with surgical precision, knowing full well that it was a loaded one. Barron could either admit to the privileges of his birth or he could challenge the very foundation of his critics' arguments. Barron didn't flinch. Instead, he smiled faintly, as though he had anticipated her line of questioning. A name can open doors, but it's up to the person to walk through them. I've had opportunities, yes, but it's my actions that will define my path, not where I started. The response was clear, deliberate. It was not a defense. It was a declaration. Barron was not looking to distance himself from his family, but rather to frame himself in a way that allowed him to transcend it. Eleanor's brow furrowed, a small nod of recognition passing across her face. She wasn't dealing with an ordinary subject here. This young man, though young in years, had already learned how to navigate the complexities of legacy and public perception. I see, but you know as well as I do that there's an undeniable weight in that name, Eleanor said, leaning in. How does it affect you? Do you think you'll ever escape it, or will it always define you? Barron's voice was calm and steady as he replied, I don't need to escape anything. It's not about running from something. It's about standing in the light I create for myself. A ripple of applause spread through the audience. Eleanor paused, absorbing the weight of his words. She had expected a battle. What she got was a man who had already defined his terms, a man who had found a way to speak directly to the heart of her questions. Eleanor didn't waste time. She dove into the next critical question. Let's talk about your place in the media. Despite being in the public eye for most of your life, you've kept a low profile. What made you choose now to speak out, to step forward into the spotlight? She tested him with a question about timing, knowing that Barron's decision to appear was not without calculation. The public had been wondering for years, why had Barron Trump, a figure whose name alone carried weight, remained largely silent, even as the world around him buzzed with headlines? Why had he chosen now to finally step into the limelight? Barron took a moment, his gaze unflinching. His eyes locked onto Eleanor's, steady, almost as if he were evaluating the question itself before answering. There was no rush, no attempt to fill the silence. The air in the room seemed to slow, every eye in the hall focused on his every movement. Then he answered with his usual calm, Silence isn't always the answer, Eleanor. Sometimes people need more than stories, they need to hear from the right people. I'm here to do just that. The room shifted again. Eleanor could feel the conversation slipping from her control. Barron was not merely answering questions. He was presenting his narrative, defining the terms of this conversation. Every question she asked seemed to roll off of him as if he had anticipated her approach, prepared for each turn. You've made your presence known now, but the question remains, are you planning to enter politics? After all, the pressure to follow your family's footsteps is immense. Can you truly avoid it? Eleanor leaned in, her voice soft but laced with authority. This was the question on everyone's mind. Was Barron merely testing the waters, or was he preparing to plunge into the deep end of politics, following in his father's legacy, or perhaps even surpassing it? For the first time, Barron hesitated. It was almost imperceptible, a slight pause before he spoke, as if weighing the consequences of his words. The tension in the room became palpable. Eleanor noticed, and in that moment, she realized she had pushed him to a vulnerable space. But just as quickly, Barron answered with a coolness that stunned the audience. I don't intend to follow in anyone's footsteps, but if the time comes and it's necessary, I won't shy away from it either. It's not about who you're related to. It's about the work you put in and the change you can create. The room was electric with anticipation. The tension thickened as Barron Trump, the young heir to one of the most influential political dynasties in modern history, answered the question in a way no one expected. He had deftly sidestepped the issue of legacy, instead emphasizing the importance of action over affiliation. The audience, uncertain at first, now seemed captivated by his calm assurance. Eleanor took a moment, absorbing the shift. She wasn't used to this. In her career, she had broken down political figures, exposing them for the world to see. But Barron Trump wasn't just a figurehead. He was different. He was navigating this conversation in ways she had not anticipated. The conversation took another turn as Eleanor pushed further. You've spent a lifetime watching the media, observing the power structures. Do you see yourself as the right person to disrupt them? Barron's expression didn't change. His voice remained steady, firm, but there was a glint of something, perhaps resolve, in his eyes. People should decide that for themselves. I'm not here to tell anyone what they should think. I'm here to show them what's possible. Eleanor nodded, recognizing something in Barron's words. He wasn't interested in imposing his views or forcing others to follow him. He was offering a different path, a different kind of leadership. This wasn't just a young man stepping into the political arena. It was a potential game changer. A new kind of leadership that didn't rely on the traditional roots or structures, but instead one that would challenge the very notion of what politics could be. There was a pause as the crowd digested Barron's words. The conversation was no longer about political legacy. It was about something more. Eleanor could feel the shift in the air. She knew she was witnessing a change in the conversation, a change that Barron Trump was orchestrating on his own terms. He was no longer simply the subject of discussion, he was actively shaping it. As the interview neared its conclusion, Eleanor asked one final question that would likely define Barron's future. One last question, Barron. If America came to you and asked you to lead, would you say yes? Barron paused again. The question hung in the air. Eleanor watched closely, hoping for a sign, some flicker of emotion, a sign that Barron might reveal something deeper. But he didn't. Instead, his eyes remained steady, unwavering. The room was absolutely silent. It was as if everyone was waiting for this single moment, this single answer, to reshape everything. Then Barron smiled. It wasn't a smirk nor a grin. It was something more subtle, a smile that conveyed assurance, but also a deep understanding of the gravity of the question. The real question isn't whether I would say yes, Barron replied, his voice smooth but deliberate. It's whether America is ready for a leader who thinks differently. The audience erupted. Gasps filled the room as murmurs of excitement spread like wildfire. Barron had turned the question back on Eleanor, and with it had subtly shifted the entire discussion. It wasn't about whether he would step into politics. It was about whether the political system was ready for a different kind of leadership. Eleanor, momentarily stunned, regained her composure. She had been bested, outwitted by Barron's response, but she couldn't help but recognize the brilliance of it. He hadn't confirmed anything. He hadn't denied anything. He had simply reshaped the question and turned it into something far more profound. The entire conversation had now shifted, and Barron had not only kept control, but had also set the stage for what would come next. The audience reacted again, a mixture of applause, chatter, and even whispers of admiration. Eleanor quickly adjusted her stance, trying to regain her footing in the conversation. "So you are considering it then?" she asked, her tone measured. Her voice dropped slightly, as though trying to lead Barron into a commitment. Barron, however, gave the faintest of smiles. "Leadership isn't about the position you hold. It's about the kind of change you bring to it," he replied. His words rang with certainty, and yet they left enough room for speculation. He wasn't committing, but he wasn't denying either. He was carefully managing the narrative, giving the audience just enough to wonder, to debate, to ponder the implications. The interview was drawing to a close, but the impact was only beginning to sink in. Barron Trump had not only answered questions, he had redefined the entire conversation. He had transformed the interview from a simple political debate into a platform for his vision, his perspective, and his future. The cameras began to fade as the interview neared its final moments, but the impact of Barron's words had already settled into the atmosphere like a thick fog. The tension in the room had transformed into something almost tangible, a sense of recognition that had spread across the audience like wildfire. The people in the seats and the millions watching from their homes weren't simply seeing a man who was answering questions. They were witnessing the emergence of something bigger. A new narrative was beginning to take shape. As the crowd began to settle down, the murmurs of the press started to fade as well. Reporters, analysts, and journalists gathered in small groups, discussing, dissecting, trying to make sense of what had just transpired. The consensus was clear. Barron Trump had completely owned the room. He had deflected every trap with ease and crafted a narrative that was uniquely his own. He wasn't just a figure in the background anymore. He had placed himself squarely in the spotlight, and the world was taking notice. Eleanor, though she had spent years navigating the political landscape, couldn't help but feel a sense of admiration creeping into her thoughts. She had entered the interview expecting to break down the young man sitting across from her. Instead, she found herself face to face with a strategist, someone who had long been observing, waiting for the perfect moment to make his move. And now, with just a few calculated answers, Barron Trump had shifted the conversation. He had redefined what it meant to be a public figure, to be part of a legacy, and even to consider leadership. In the hours that followed, the media erupted. Newspapers and TV stations scrambled to cover every angle of the interview, analyzing Barron's every word. Some hailed him as a visionary, a figure capable of reshaping the future of politics. Others were more skeptical, claiming that he was simply a product of privilege, trying to use his name to further his own interests. But one thing was undeniable. Barron Trump had made his presence known in a way few could have anticipated. He wasn't just playing defense anymore. He was in full control. As the evening wore on, Barron sat alone in a private room backstage, watching the news unfold. He saw clips of his answers being repeated, headlines flashing across the screen with his name in bold letters. He knew this was just the beginning. The real battle hadn't even started yet, but the shift had been made. He had set the stage for what would come next, and he wasn't about to let anyone forget it. Barron's phone buzzed on the table beside him. He glanced at the screen, seeing a message from his father. "You did well today. Stay focused. The world is watching." A small smile tugged at Barron's lips. His father's approval was always a complex thing. Barron had long struggled with the weight of his last name, and yet in moments like this, he realized that the name itself didn't matter as much as the actions he took. The world would define him on his own terms. He didn't need to rely on his father's legacy to carve out his own. The phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from an old acquaintance, someone who had long been a part of the family's circle of influence. "You've changed the game tonight, Barron. If you ever decide to step into politics, let me know. The doors are open." Barron set the phone down, letting out a deep breath. He had heard messages like this for years. People had tried to nudge him in different directions, hoping he would follow in the footsteps of others who had come before him. But Barron wasn't ready to step into a mold that had already been defined. His path was his own to carve. The interview had been a calculated move, a test not only of the political world's readiness to accept him, but of his own readiness to take the plunge. He had spent years observing, watching as the world around him shifted, and now it was his turn to step into the arena. He wasn't sure if he would run for office or follow the traditional political route. The idea of leadership, true leadership, was about more than just holding a title. It was about bringing change, challenging the status quo, and reimagining what the future could look like. Whether or not the world was ready for that kind of change, Barron didn't know. But what he did know was this: the conversation had started, and he was going to be a part of it. As the days passed, Barron continued to maintain his composed demeanor. He had retreated from the public eye for a time, letting the world digest the aftermath of his debut. The interview had sparked a firestorm of debate, but Barron knew the public's memory was short-lived. People would move on to the next headline, the next controversy. But not Barron. He was preparing for the next stage, the next conversation that would keep him in the spotlight, driving the narrative forward. And then, in an unexpected twist, Barron announced his plans. Not for a political run, not yet at least, but for something bigger. A global initiative to reshape public discourse. The aim was simple: to create a platform where leaders, thinkers, and everyday people could come together and discuss the future of the world in an open, unfiltered space. He called it the Visionary Project. The announcement sent shockwaves across the political and media landscapes. Barron Trump was no longer a passive participant in the world's conversations. He was actively reshaping them. In doing so, he had positioned himself not just as a political figure, but as a leader in a broader sense. A leader for the new era, one that demanded new thinking, new leadership, and a new way forward. The media, once skeptical, now began to take Barron's ideas seriously. His platform wasn't just about politics. It was about global change, about creating a world where the conversations of tomorrow could be heard today. Barron's name had changed overnight from one that had been whispered in the halls of politics to one that was now shouted from the rooftops. The world had finally recognized that Baron Trump wasn't just the son of his father. He was Baron Trump, a force in his own right.